Our next presenter, we're shifting disciplines. Dr. Shelly Rambo is Associate Professor of Theology at Boston University School of Theology. Her research and teaching interests focus on religious responses to trauma and moral injury. She's author of Spirit and Trauma, A Theology of Remaining, Resurrecting Wounds, Living in the Afterlife of Trauma, and a co-edited volume with Wendy Cadge, Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care in the 21st Century. She's currently directing a Lilly Endowment grant on trauma-responsive congregations, focusing on supporting urban congregational leaders in their efforts to respond to collective trauma. And her presentation today is titled Existential Overwhelm and the Value of Nurturing Questions Over Time, Implications for Metabolizing Vicarious Trauma and Moral Distress to Promote Resilience. Please come up, Dr. Rambo. Thank you.
I want to thank my colleague Steve Sandage and the Danielson Institute for always risking an invitation to a theologian who remains, as I'll say, always clinically curious, but humble and in my position in relationship to so many esteemed therapists. So I wrote out my talk to be mindful of time, and I just want to say that when a title is offered, it often is modified in the process of actually writing the presentation. When asked what people want from chaplains, Reverend Amy Green, chaplaincy educator at Cleveland Clinic, responded, "Someone who can see their total pain." What does this require of a chaplain? Over time, I have thought about this statement in two ways. Like Green, the word total refers to the whole person, the desire of patients to be seen in more holistic terms beyond their symptoms. The second is to consider the total environment that impacts the person, a more systemic approach. This word total falls heavy on me. It sounds exhausting. If that is what care recipients want, what does this require of care providers? For the past 10 years, I have been paying attention to chaplains, spiritual care providers working in public settings, often first responders to trauma. They carry narratives and perform rituals that name life's pivotal moments as sacred. I am attentive to the wisdom they offer, the under-recognized skills of translating between religious frameworks and various institutional settings. More recently, I am working with congregational leaders responding to the needs of vulnerable communities. One leader working with unhoused folks admitted, "If I name the trauma, I fear that I will open up a can of worms." He was questioning his competence, but he was also questioning his emotional and spiritual capacity to hold the pain that might emerge. We know from current research conducted by several of my colleagues in this room that this total work is taking a toll. These communities of care providers were on my mind as I prepared these comments. What does it require to meet someone in their total pain? And how do you do this by sustaining your own spirit? So my aim today is straightforward, to speak into this problem from a non-clinical but clinically appreciative position. I hope to demonstrate the richness of narrative naming and renaming by engaging the insights of Howard Thurman. I hope to expand the interdisciplinary glossary to name what we are experiencing both professionally and personally. Reverend Howard Thurman is a mystic, a preacher, and often recognized as a spiritual mentor to the civil rights movement. In 1953, he stepped into the role of Dean of Boston University's Marsh Chapel, the first Black minister to hold such a position in the United States. He was a lifelong higher education chaplain. In every setting, he tended to the spiritual needs of university communities by doing one-on-one counseling sessions, preaching to congregations, teaching courses on the spiritual disciplines. His ministry spanned decades, but the height of his professional career took place during the racially polarized decades of the 1950s and 60s. His sermon texts could be lifted from the pages of our current headlines. A keen observer of human behavior, he held a dogged belief that people can change behavior under the right conditions. He was a ruminator, a brooder, with a whole glossary of terms to describe the human condition, to name the creature under conditions of threat, and to diagnose the problems of society. His interdisciplinary biopsychosocial spiritual glossary drew people to hear him speak. He also developed techniques to move people to change their behavior. So I want to explore in this brief time a question that he kept returning to over 5 decades. How does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? If you know of Thurman, you know that he asked a lot of questions. But this one was a long conversation that spanned time and place. It was the question arising from historical trauma. It was the question of his own personal trauma. And it was the question he posed to the societal trauma of segregation. The question originates from a particular situation and a particular people. This was the question that Thurman asked when he first glimpsed the coast of Africa, that he asked to his enslaved ancestors who survived the Middle Passage. Looking out the sea cabin window, he writes in his journal, "How does the human spirit accommodate itself to desolation? How did they? What tools of the Spirit were in their hands with which to cut a path through the wilderness of their despair?" It was a question whose answers came from the spiritual and sung testimonies of the ancestors, expressed in songs like Deep River, Wade in the Water, and Jacob's Ladder. But Thurman asked it multiple times over decades. Recalling his childhood in the American South, he writes, "The fact that 25 years of my life were spent in Florida and in Georgia has left deep scars in my spirit." It was the question he posed in response to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision when white Christian ministers were slow to act, advocating instead for slow incremental change. Informed by all three, Thurman moved this question between the particular and the universal. There is something deeply particular about the human spirit, and yet his spiritual traditions speak about a shared condition, about existence more broadly. Appeals to universals or a shared condition are fraught as we receive it in postmodern or with post-truth ears. This universalizing of the human condition has not fared well for those in non-dominant groups. For Thurman, the common ground, the shared condition, was not a concept or a theory, but an internal relationship that is accessible to everyone. The ability to imagine healing depends on the activation of an experience that is unconditioned. This is important because the external forces of disregard are so strong that if there is not an internal reference, an internal anchor, an internal center, one may be completely defined externally. The human spirit can only sustain itself against disregard if it has an experience of total regard. This is the significance of religious experience for Thurman. In religious experience, one enters into a felt sense of total regard. One experiences oneself as fully known and fully seen. It's an experience that brings one into their sense of ultimate worth. For Thurman, this is an intensely private, personal, and interior experience. He spatializes this experience by speaking of an area of relation in which one comes to know themselves as unconditioned, our inner sea or our center. There is this unconditioned area in everyone that can be accessed, but it often remains unaccessed. Through religious experience, one comes into an awareness of oneself in a climate of total regard. A communing takes place in which one is able to exercise the soul. Mystics refer to it as the soul, but Thurman, who's a thoroughly modern thinker, refers to it as conscience. He names this communing area the fluid area of consent. This area is an imagined sphere of movement in which one enacts what we might call spiritual agency. If you visit this area, say for example in prayer or meditation, you gain focus and clarity. Thurman imagines it as an ethical center in which one comes into complete focus. Intuition, intention, and desire are perfectly aligned and coordinated. In this fluid area, one communes with God. But for Thurman, God is also life, capital L, is also spirit, capital S, and is also the deepest knowledge of oneself. Some traditions name this theistically and others do not. Thurman, like many chaplains, moves in and out of religious vocabulary to describe this relationship of communing. He's not concerned about maintaining strong distinctions between God and the human. In communing, these distinctions fall away. And yet, here's the paradox. In that experience, one sees themselves from another point of view. Thurman's description of religious experience combines cognition and sensation. It is as if you gain your greatest footing, stand up tall, always keep your head up, Graham and Nancy would tell him. But simultaneously, you feel a sense of warmth, unlike anything you've experienced before. Your skin tingles. When Thurman speaks about this in Creative Encounter, he describes it as a rerouting of the neural pathways, akin to how somatic practitioners of trauma describe how to engage the senses to regulate affect. He writes, quote, "In the sheer repetition of the religious experience, certain organic changes begin to take place in the very structure of the nervous system itself." Describing religious experience is really challenging. Thurman said, "You can't really teach it. You can only testify to it. I can tell you what chocolate tastes like, but until you taste it, you don't really know chocolate." So to describe it, Thurman moves to metaphors, allegories, and vignettes of everyday encounters. Remember when the barista at a coffee shop who doesn't even know your name prepares your drink minutes before you walk in? Unprompted by the mobile app, they have, in some small way, participated in creating a climate of familiarity. It's not full regard, but it is a sliver of it. Start there, Thurman says. Pay attention to such moments. What does it feel like to be brought into this climate of regard? Thurman likens religious experience to a running broad jump. He doesn't name Jesse Owens, but the Olympian who broke records in 1936 must have been on Thurman's mind. The path on the right, the cinder path, or maybe asphalt, I don't know what the terrain would be now. The path on the right is the training ground of religious experience. This is the region of practice in which one trains intensively for a competition. They return to that cinder path again and again. During practice, there are no fans in the stands. There, the athlete cultivates intuition, sets their intention, hones their desire, minimizes distraction, and revisits their goals and purposes. Consider all that goes into training. The cinder path becomes the most trusted ground. When the athlete arrives at the threshold of the sand pit, at the point of launch, the trained athlete brings all that training into a single moment, a single action. The trained athlete has complete focus. He or she has been training for this one moment. Thurman describes the launch itself as the activation of all the resources of one's life. Focused, this momentum lifts the athlete into the air. Once their feet lift off the landing, what happens? We don't quite know, Thurman says. And yet such experiences leave a residue, which he curiously calls the God residue. This residue lodges as a body or sensory memory of the experience of communing. For Thurman, the ethical nerve center is mixed with intuition and sensation. It's warm, akin to the feeling of being embraced. It lingers as a felt sensation of total regard. No one can take that memory from you, but the memory can fade. Thurman, as preacher, views his role in this way, to conjure the memory of religious experience in public. The residue is there, but it can be so faint that we can forget it. The role of the preacher, perhaps clinician, is to assist a person in recalling the experience of total regard. This is specifically important, Thurman believed, for communities of color, because it summons an experience that's necessary for sustaining the sense of self-regard in a world that disregards you. The fluid area is a sphere of mobility in a world that denies agency. When the force fields of hatred are all around you, he reminds his listeners, you can access this center. When centered, the human spirit is able to withstand anything. But remember, Thurman often addresses predominantly white audiences. Segregation, he writes, is a violation of the human spirit. Segregation fuels cycles of shame and humiliation. White people have built up immunity to seeing the harm of segregation. In religious experience, the spirit is confronted, no longer protected. Religious experience entails a confrontation with truth, but note, he believed always still under the conditions of total regard. This is challenging to parse, Thurman says, especially when society operates with such polarizing logic. So we could ask, is Thurman just saying that the soul should accommodate or conform to the present circumstances? Or is he using accommodation differently, choosing that term carefully as accommodation of homemaking or finding accommodations in a hostile world? If the memory of religious experience can be recalled, Thurman believes that it can be mobilized in everyday living. And here he follows the tradition of what his Quaker teacher Rufus Jones called affirmative mysticism. When you think of mystics, you may think of those who withdraw from the world. But Thurman's mysticism is expressed in and not apart from the world. For Thurman, affirmative mystics bring everything of their lives to the religious encounter. They're trained athletes. That cinder path is not a blank slate. It's all of your history, all of your people, all of your cumulative experiences. He calls it your equipment, right? You're a trained athlete. It's all the equipment you bring. You come to that experience, he also says, with the smell of life on you. Religious experience provides a conditioning ground for moving in a world that limits your movement. When you go about your daily living, you will be able to register climates of ill will and hostility. because you know warmth, because you have felt worth and worthiness, you look for it everywhere. But looks alone can be deceiving because the behaviors and actions of people can look okay on the surface, but religious experience can train you to register what's really going on below the surface. You need fine-tuned senses to do this. Thurman says, as well, you can sniff and smell the climate. So what does this have to do with existential or spiritual fatigue in your work as a spiritual care provider or clinician? I may have gotten far off topic, but Thurman often did. And yet he kept returning listeners to what happens in religious experience, what religious experience makes possible, believing it to be the anchor for everything. It's not hard to see all the ways that Thurman can resonate with clinical practice or the therapeutic environment. And indeed, we have evidence that Thurman was interested in the psychological, social, and natural sciences. He was describing the phenomenon of trauma and moral injury before those terms were in the public vocabulary. So I want to lift up some insights for your consideration as clinicians or spiritual care practitioners. Thurman, I think, imagines the spiritual care environment in 4 ways. First, your work is to help someone access this internal reference of regard. If someone has this, they can, in his terms, inoculate themselves against the toxic climates that disregard them. When working with communities who have been disregarded, you are looking for this internal reference. Where has someone felt this? Second, you can guide someone to it, but you can't do the conditioning work for them. Thurman says as much. What is that for you? I don't know. This is like a Thurman, conversation. What's that for you? I don't know. I can guide you there, but the work is yours to do. And this requires a posture of humility. Thurman would call it a reverence for personality. Third, they have been there before. This is the spiritual reasoning that's different from, I would think, the clinical. This is the mystical dimension, according to Thurman. It's his interpretation of human origins. There is within each creature an uncreated element that can never be altered, the God or divinity within, or the inner light. But we can lose sight of it to such a degree by external forces and internal processes. We can lose sight of it, right? You, in your practice, are summoning this uncreated element. You both do know and don't know this place in another. It is both radically personal and private, and yet universal. Fourth, you cannot guide someone there if you do not know this sense of communing yourself. You look for it in another by looking for it in yourself. He expresses it again through the sense of smell. You are sniffing it out in them because you are on the hunt for it in yourself. Thurman would also ask, who has done this for you? Who and where are you reminded of this? Where have you felt this sense of total regard? What do people want from chaplains? They want someone to see them in their total pain. I put Thurman in front of you because he provides a unique vocabulary for the set of issues and topics we're addressing in this conference. There's a resonance with psychologists. He would say, we're about the same thing, to interpret existence. And more specifically, to interpret existence under conditions of threat. How does the human animal behave when put under the conditions of fear, deception, and hate? Those are the 3 hounds of hell that Thurman describes. How do we behave under such conditions? For communities that have their backs against the wall, marginalized or BIPOC communities, the conditions are biopsychosocial and spiritual. He names the segregation as the anatomy of segregation. The word anatomy shouldn't be ignored. So he should be of interest to us because he was thinking somatically about systematic oppression and its spiritual effects. And at the end of a taxing day, Thurman was known to make his way to Jordan Marsh Department Store down near Downtown Crossing. And on really taxing days, he would ride escalators for 30 to 35 minutes. When you see the total picture, what's your escalator? So with Thurman, I'm inviting you to consider your spiritually informed clinical work in a different way. When you bring someone into the arena of your regard, it's a conditioning ground for personal and collective transformation. He believes that prayer, meditation, body movement, all techniques for self-regulation, can ready the spirit and stimulate the spiritual nervous system to make a big leap. This leaping quality has the potential to cut into hostile climates, mobilizing personal regard into the wider atmosphere. All of the equipment of one's life is integrated at the moment of the launch. When the running broad jumper lifts their feet off the ground, there is potential for the whole environment to change. Imagine the fans in the stands watching the gravity-defying motion. In mid-air, Thurman says a ball of light disperses. Tiny shards of light scatter into the atmosphere, and the jump throws light on all the known materials. The leap is exhilarating. The fans rise to their feet. We could say that the Olympics is an exceptional event, but Thurman provides dozens of vignettes that feature little moments that display this leaping quality. In everyday moments, the arena of the inner life can radiate, setting off glimmers of light, changing the environments of everything around. Everyday moments of universal significance. The human spirit can only sustain itself against disregard if it has an experience of total regard. And I would imagine Thurman, the preacher in this space, closing with this. This is what we train for. This is what we do. Thank you.